Bandwidth for the Hauger History Podcast graciously donated by Podbean.com, and this microphone donated by Samson. Thanks for supporting educational podcasts. Welcome to the Hauger History Podcast with Mr. Hauger. I am the second part, and I borrowed that line from Paul F. Tompkins. Today we're going to be talking about a couple of different sections in 6th grade social studies, including the ancient Israelites and the Kingdom of Israel, talking about 1,000 years B.C. before the Common Era, and some of the things that you'll want to know as you review for your 6th grade social studies tests. In many different areas of the country, this is part of your curriculum and your standards, so this podcast could be helpful and educational to you. There are a couple credits should go out when making this podcast. Shout out to my friend Mrs. McLaughlin for lending me some information, and shout out to my favorite religion teacher of all time, Rabbi Henry Schreibman over in Marinwood in Marin County, California. Thanks for being such an open-minded, respectable, and fun religion teacher in Western religions at Dominican University of California back in 05-06. Really appreciated your lectures. There's one teacher thinking another. Let's jump right into the podcast today. Jerusalem has had many different names throughout its history, even before King David and the story of David and Goliath and the slingshot, which I wonder if The Simpsons was thinking about when Bart Simpson got one. Before King David conquered Jerusalem, the city was called Jebus. King David renamed it the City of David. An account of the Assyrians conquering of the city referred to it as Judah. Our history text acknowledges a period of time for about 200 years after the uniting that King David did of the 12 tribes of Israel, where Judah was separated from Israel in two different regions and almost like city-states. But the Israelites chose a new king because the Philistines at the time of 1000 BC were the strongest people in Canaan. The Israelites really feared them. They felt like they were divided and fighting amongst themselves, and the Philistines were a tough and daunting opponent. So what they did to keep from quarreling among themselves and to save their religion is asking Samuel, who was one of the prophets, to choose a king. A prophet is a vocabulary word you're probably studying, is a person who claims to be instructed by God. And Samuel warned that the Israelites should be careful about having a king, but they named Saul as king anyway. Samuel anointed him, and according to the Old Testament, King Saul displeased God, so God chose another name, King David. God told Samuel to anoint David in secret. And something that you've probably discussed in your class was, what was the warning against having a king? And it was Samuel that was trying to think and tell people that the Israelites would become enslaved and had to pay taxes if they had a king, and they've seen many similar empires that had gone before and trying to avoid the pitfalls. And if there's anything you learn in history in 6th grade and 7th grade and 8th grade, people tend to not like taxes very much. You might have heard us talking about that presently. David and Solomon. David was a famous warrior. The story of Goliath, who was a giant Philistine, a large man with a slingshot and stones as a heavy underdog, made David famous all around the territory, and the story is still told to this day. King Saul put David in charge of the army, but later he kind of grew envious. David was very popular, was very charismatic, and was quite the leader. So David took the throne, he drove the Philistines out, conquered other countries, and he built his empire. He expanded borders. An empire was built that ruled several other nations, and really the high point of the Kingdom of Israel was at this time at about 1000 BC. The conquered people had to pay tribute to David, which would be done in money or slaves, and Israelites had to pay heavy taxes. So in one end, that prediction came to fruition. Solomon was David's son who took the throne after David's death, and this started a line of succession, meaning that my son and then his son will lead, and then his son, and it'll stay in the family. So it's something that's happened in many different areas. And as we've talked about in other cultures too, when the leader passes away, it often leaves doubt, unrest, and sometimes disagreement over who should be in control of the empire next. But Solomon, David's son, he built the stone temple in Jerusalem that David had always wanted to see constructed. And he was known for his proverbs, or his wise sayings. Proverbs, wise sayings. When Solomon died, the 12 tribes of Israel began fighting amongst themselves. And it, just like you might realize in class, if you get a pocket of students who aren't focused or can start dividing or bring negativity up, it can soon cause a lot of dismay for the leader to try to control things. So 10 of the nations moved to the north and became the Kingdom of Israel. The other 2 of the 12 moved south and called their nation the Kingdom of Judah. There's great maps of this in our text, and there probably is in yours as well. The capital of Judah was Jerusalem, and the people of Jerusalem were called Jews for the first time during Solomon's time. And David wanted this temple so badly, and Solomon was able to build that for his father's memory and also for his people. Why? If it comes up on a question of discussion, David wanted the Israelites to have a permanent place for their sacred objects, a place of worship, a place that would be holy, and somewhere that could be a firm physical specimen showing devout foundations and devout place for respect to pay tribute to God and their God. This was a troubled time when we had 2 kingdoms, and I say we as we learn about these kingdoms. After creating the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, many Israelites forgot their religion. Some lost it, some chose a different way, some just went astray. And the prophets told the Israelites not to do that they should return to God's laws and create a just society. According to the records of our textbook and other textbooks as well, the Assyrians would come and conquer Israel and disperse those 10 tribes throughout their empire. This is a vocabulary word in many of the textbooks that I've seen. Exiled, disperse the tribes throughout their empire, forced to divide, to sparsely arrange themselves, no longer unified as a nation. Now, these Israelites lost their religion and were often called the lost tribes of Israel in common vernacular. Now, the Assyrian Samaritans came around. They were settled around Samaria, the land, and they thought God would be angry with them for taking the Israelites' land. And to appease God, they offered sacrifices and began to follow the Israelites' religion. The people of Judah believed that God only accepted sacrifices from the temple at Jerusalem, so they believed they were God's only people, the chosen people, as we learn about at our school, and you might learn about at your school as well, depending on where you're educated and what background you have as well. Now, the Egyptians conquered the kingdom after the Assyrians, after the Samaritans in 620 BC as we move to the middle of our modern BCE and Common Era timeline. The Chaldeans came in and they also conquered Egypt, kicked them out, and became the rulers of Judah in 605 BC. The Jews were joining in forces with the Egyptians, would conquer the Chaldeans, and now we bring it to Daniel, which is my namesake. King Nebuchadnezzar comes along, and the Chaldeans captured Jerusalem and punished the Jews, sent 10,000 Jews to Babylon, and appointed a new Jewish king. And the story of Daniel in the lion's den and him predicting dreams is in the Old Testament, so if you're religious, you may know more about that as well. In 586 BC, the Jews revolted against the Chaldeans, and the Chaldean ruler crushed Jerusalem. That's a lot of back and forth. The Chaldeans took the king of Judah and thousands of Jews to Babylon. And what should you know about all that? I mean, that's quite a lot of information, and it's very specific, and those who didn't go to a religious school might have difficulty following it or placing value or trying to put markers in the important material here. But basically, there was a message that the prophets brought to the Israelites. And historians, whether they were religious or not, will acknowledge that these people did believe these things and that these events were taking place. And the prophets warned that the Israelites, that they should be faithful to God. And that was more than simply going to the temple and worship, but it meant working for a just society here on earth and dealing fairly with other people. And that's something that Christians would later adapt. But even more so, this was an emphasis, and still is today in Judaism, that we should be working for fairness in society today and not be so much concerned about what will be rewarded with in heaven, but to work and make heaven on earth today. And in a very, very, very small way, maybe I've done that in a podcast? Okay, that might be high praise of myself, but if I don't do it, who's going to? How about some praise on Twitter? At Hauger History, Hauger. You can go to www.dannyhauger.com for an archive, how to subscribe to this podcast. Don't forget to check it out on YouTube as well. And we'll see you in the next edition as we study and review more 6th grade social studies. This is Mr. Hauger pushing your chairs, and we'll see you next time.